Welcome to Myth as a Noun with Greg Salyer. We begin with a story about stories. A missionary once undertook to instruct a group of Indians in the truths of his holy religion. He told them of the creation of the earth in 6 days and of the fall of our first parents by eating an apple. The courteous natives listened attentively, and after thanking him, one related in his turn a very ancient tradition concerning the origin of corn. But the missionary plainly showed his disgust and disbelief, indignantly saying, "What I delivered to you were sacred truths, but this that you tell me is mere fable and falsehood." "My brother," gravely replied the offended Indian, "it seems that you have not been well grounded in the rules of civility. You saw that we, who practice these rules, believed your stories. Why then do you not believe ours?" Charles Eastman's account here is instructive on many levels, since it portrays a phenomenon that is rarely seen in print, the direct interaction of two vastly different mythologies. Even more importantly, the story is about the interpretation of mythologies, and that is especially helpful for our study. The missionary believes that his story is true in a way that allows no other stories, since they are, by definition, mere fable and falsehood. The Indians in this story, possibly the Seneca or the Wahpeton Sioux, have a different mythology, one that welcomes stories and has an etiquette of listening attached, the rules of civility. In fact, the native people here are not being simply courteous. They believed the missionary's story and were offended that he did not believe theirs. How is it that the missionary can believe that one story trumps all others? How is it that the native people believe that no story can trump any other? How is it possible to believe two different stories, two different truths at the same time? The answer to these questions is mythology. In fact, the answer to many questions, like the ones above, is mythology, something that will become clear as the course progresses. For now, we can say that the native people in the Eastman story were inhabiting a mythology that valued the multiplicity of stories, while the missionary was inhabiting a mythology that valued only one story. But what does it mean to inhabit a mythology? And what does mythology have to do with truth? To get some answers, we need to do a little intellectual history. We need to go back to Plato. Often called the father of Western thought, and for good reason, Plato was not the first philosopher, but he was the thinker whose influence is the broadest and deepest. A 20th century philosopher named Alfred North Whitehead famously said that Western philosophy consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. Accordingly, we must turn to Plato to understand contemporary notions of myth. And given the ubiquity of Western culture, it is this understanding of myth that comes into play most often. What made Plato so influential was that he changed humanity's way of thinking from myth to truth. As a Greek, Plato inherited a culture that was rife with myth, from Homer's epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, to Hesiod's Theogony. He knew these stories well and appreciated their didactic and entertainment value. As a philosopher, however, Plato had inherited something more: his teacher Socrates' love of truth. For both Socrates and Plato, truth was something that existed in ideal form, and thus stood above human beings and our flimsy and ever-changing opinions. Truth was eternal and unchanging, and our highest duty was to reach for that ideal form. To do that, we had to purge all fable and falsehood, because they cloud our vision of the truth. Sound familiar? That's the same language the missionary used in the Eastman story. The technical terminology that we use to describe Plato's dramatic change in Western culture is that he moved it from muthos to logos, two Greek words that correspond roughly to myth and truth. We can go directly from that observation to our popular understanding of myth as falsehood, as in the myth of the perfect girl or guy. So in condemning the native people for their rejection of his story, the missionary is invoking Plato's logos or truth against their muthos or fable and falsehood. That leaves another question unanswered. What about the native understanding of mythology, and how did they allow for many stories instead of only one? Interestingly enough, this answer also involves Plato, or at least Plato is a marker we can use. There was something else significant happening with Plato's seismic shift from muthos to logos, and that was the effects of writing upon the human psyche. Writing had begun in Sumeria around 2600 BCE, and perhaps even earlier in China, but it would be many centuries before the technology was perfected into books that could be widely used. Plato was just beginning to see the effects of writing upon culture and memory in his time. Even now, most of human history has taken place in oral cultures, not literate ones. It might seem that the differences between a culture that communicates through word of mouth and one that uses writing are minimal, but studies have shown that they are actually quite profound. In fact, the differences between orality and literacy may be responsible for the very different ways we understand the world. To attempt to understand an oral culture, that is a culture without writing, we have to exercise our imagination. Take a moment and do this. Subtract all technology from your life. There are no phones, even analog phones if you remember those. Tablets, computers, cars, even large buildings. If you have shelter, you have made it yourself, and you can eat, but only what you kill or grow. You likely live in a community, and you have language and culture. But if you go on even a day's journey, you are cut off from your society and all that it affords you. What is important to you now? The answer is food, water, shelter, and safety. How do you acquire these things? You acquire these things by learning them from others, your community. How do you do that? You do that through language, your most important tool, more important even than fire. What will the language look like, and how will it work? Well, here's where the answer gets especially interesting and relevant to our course. The language will not be like the language we use now, because our language is based on writing. For example, there would be no lists. Lists are a function of writing. There will be no maps. Maps are a kind of writing. In fact, language will not look like anything. Rather, it will sound like something. Those sounds will take the form of words, and those words will take the form of story. Imagine trying to tell someone who is going to take a journey about the way and the dangers along it. You could tell them that there is a panther that stalks a certain hill. But which hill? That there is water at the base of a cliff. But which cliff? And that there is shelter in a cave on the north side of the mesa. But which mesa? If you cannot write all this down, it quickly becomes too much to remember. What you need is a form of language that will string all this information together in a memorable way. What you need is a good story. And when you live in an oral culture, the more stories you hear, the more information you have. You can go directly from that fact to the native people's openness to the missionary's myth and surprise at his rejection of theirs. The meanings of myth range from fable and falsehood to the deepest truth. And thus, the student of myth can easily become lost in this semantic sea. It may be helpful then to see these various meanings in relation to one another and to where they live in terms of mythology, culture, and consciousness. Myth exists on a continuum that we might see as follows, and I have put it in terms of an archaeological tell. The first and most important thing to understand in any discussion of myth is where one is on this continuum, or within this tell. There are points between those marked here. This continuum is also why defining myth is so difficult. Despite the stark differences between the missionary and the natives in the Eastman story, there is one striking similarity that was alluded to before. Namely, they both are inhabiting a mythology. Notice that they do not have a mythology, rather it has them. They both have stories, and they are both confused because the story behind their story, the story that has them, is different. Put another way, the stories they are telling about the Garden of Eden or the origin of corn are different because the mythology informing them is different. One, the missionaries, assumes a world divided by truth and falsehood, while the other, the natives, assumes a world that is not divided at all, but is overflowing with meaning. Those separate assumptions come from another story, a deeper, frequently imperceptible one that we call myth. The story behind the story, frequently imperceptible. Myth may be sounding like something mystical at this point, but it really is not. In Daniel Quinn's novel Ishmael, the title character is trying to explain these aspects of myth to his new student. I quote it at length here for its relevance to this lecture and to the journey you're about to undertake in this course. We begin with the teacher. Mother Culture, whose voice has been in your ear since the day of your birth, has given you an explanation of how things came to be this way. You know it well. Everyone in your culture knows it well. But this explanation wasn't given to you all at once. No one ever sat you down and said, here is how things came to be this way, beginning 10 or 15 billion years ago, right up to the present. Rather, you assembled this explanation like a mosaic from a million bits of information presented to you in various ways by others who share that explanation. You assembled it from the table talk of your parents, from cartoons you watched on television, from Sunday school lessons, from your textbooks and teachers, from news broadcasts, from movies, novels, sermons, plays, newspapers, and all the rest. Are you with me so far? I think so. This explanation of how things came to be this way is ambient in your culture. Everyone knows it, and everyone accepts it without question. Okay? As we make our journey here, we're going to be re-examining key pieces of that mosaic. We're going to be taking them out of your mosaic and fitting them into an entirely different mosaic, into an entirely different explanation of how things came to be this way. Okay? And when we're finished, you'll have an entirely new perception of the world and all that's happened here. And it won't matter in the least whether you remember how that perception was assembled. The journey itself is going to change you, so you don't have to worry about memorizing the route we took to accomplish that change. Right, I see what you mean now. Third, he said, definitions. These are words that will have special meaning in our discourse here. First definition, story. A story is a scenario interrelating man, the world, and the gods. Okay? Second definition, to enact. To enact a story is to live so as to make the story a reality. In other words, to enact a story is to strive to make it come true. You recognize that this is what the people of Germany were doing under Hitler. They were trying to make the Thousand-Year Reich a reality. They were trying to make the story he was telling them come true. Right. Third definition, culture. A culture is a people enacting a story. A scenario interrelating man, the world, and the gods, a people enacting a story, and a story again is? Okay, so you're saying that the people of my culture are enacting their own story about man, the world, and the gods. That's right. But I still don't know what a story is. You will. Don't fret about it. For the moment, all you have to know is that two fundamentally different stories have been enacted here during the lifetime of man. One began to be enacted here some 2 or 3 million years ago by the people we've agreed to call leavers, and is still being enacted by them today as successfully as ever. The other began to be enacted here some 10 or 12,000 years ago by the people we've agreed to call takers, and it is apparently about to end in catastrophe. Ah, I said, meaning I know not what. You, students, may find yourself echoing this student's last line as you move through this course. But at the end, you will also find yourself with, quote, an entirely new perception of the world and all that's happened here, unquote.